I still remember the look on Howard's face when I walked into that family Christmas dinner after he'd left me for his 28-year-old assistant 3 days earlier, after he'd told everyone I was just a dependent housewife who'd be lost without him. The moment when I announced that I controlled the entire Hilton family trust, worth $47 million, was worth every year of the 30 decades I'd spent letting him believe he was the heir to everything.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because this story isn't just about a Christmas betrayal. It's about a woman who spent 32 years playing small, letting everyone believe she was powerless, while secretly holding all the cards. My name is Julia Hilton, and for most of my 58 years, I've been invisible. Not the kind of invisible where people don't see you coming down the hallway, but the kind where they look right through you, assuming they know exactly who you are and what you're worth. To the world, I was Howard Hilton's wife, Emily and Gerald's mother, Sophia's grandmother, the woman who remembered birthdays, organized holiday dinners, and kept the family running smoothly while Howard managed the important things. What nobody knew, not even Howard after 32 years of marriage, was that there never would have been any important things for him to manage without me. Howard and I met when I was 26, working as a financial advisor at a small firm in Boston. He was 29, charming in that effortless way that comes from growing up with money and expectations. The Hilton name opened doors. Old Boston family, real estate dynasty, the kind of lineage that still meant something in certain circles. What Howard lacked in business acumen, he made up for in confidence and connections. I, on the other hand, was Julia Claude from working-class Worcester. My father drove a delivery truck, my mother cleaned houses. But I had something Howard didn't, an intuitive understanding of money, investments, and how to make wealth grow rather than just spend it. By 25, I'd already turned my small inheritance from my grandmother into a modest portfolio that impressed my clients and colleagues. When Howard proposed after 8 months of dating, I was flattered and genuinely in love. The proposal came with a beautiful ring and a casual comment that nearly changed everything. Once we're married, you won't need to worry about working anymore. The Hilton Trust will take care of everything. That's when I learned the truth about the family finances. The Hilton Trust that everyone spoke of in such reverent tones was nearly depleted. Howard's father had been a gambler, his grandfather a poor businessman. The real estate empire was mostly mortgaged properties and dwindling assets. Howard himself had been living off credit and family reputation, assuming the mythical trust would eventually solve everything. A week before our wedding, Howard's family lawyer, Mr. Baron Lauren, requested a private meeting with me. I expected discussion about prenups or family protocols. Instead, I got the shock of my life. "Miss Claude," he said, spreading documents across his mahogany desk, "I need to discuss something that Howard's family isn't aware of. Your grandmother, Mrs. Colette Claude, was more than just a working-class woman from Worcester. It turned out my quiet grandmother, who I'd known as a seamstress who lived modestly and saved every penny, had been secretly investing in Boston real estate for 40 years. Every house she'd cleaned, every neighborhood she'd worked in, she'd studied and slowly, carefully bought properties under various holding companies. When she died, she'd left me everything. Not just the $50,000 I'd thought, but a real estate portfolio worth $8 million in 1991. She made me promise to watch over your investments, Mr. Lauren continued. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, Miss Claude. She saw potential in you that she recognized in herself. This inheritance comes with a condition. You must never let anyone, including a future husband, control or even know about these assets unless you choose to reveal them." I stared at the documents, my grandmother's careful handwriting on letters addressed to me, explaining her philosophy. Money is power, Julia, but the greatest power comes from others underestimating you. Let them think you're dependent while you're actually in control. So when I married Howard Hilton, I became not just his wife, but secretly the person who could save his family legacy. Over the next 32 years, I quietly used my inheritance and investment skills to rebuild the Hilton Trust. Every successful family investment Howard bragged about at dinner parties came from my analysis and my money. Every property that kept the Hilton name prestigious was purchased through holding companies I controlled. Howard believed he was the heir to a restored family fortune. In reality, he was married to the woman who'd created it.
But I didn't mind being invisible, or at least I told myself I didn't. Howard was a good father to our children, Emily and Gerald. He was charming at social events, maintaining the family connections that opened doors. He genuinely loved me, in his way. It seemed like a fair arrangement. I handled the real wealth management, while he handled the public face of success. The cracks started showing about 5 years ago when Howard hired Joanna Billets as his executive assistant for the property management company that was supposedly his domain, but was actually funded entirely by my investments. Joanna was 28, blonde, ambitious, and had an MBA from Wharton that she mentioned in every conversation. I noticed immediately how Howard's posture changed when she walked into a room, how his laugh became more animated, how he started working later hours and taking more business trips. But I trusted our marriage, our history, our family. When you've been with someone for 32 years, you assume you know them completely. I was wrong. This past December, everything came to a head in a way I never could have anticipated. The holidays had always been my domain. I planned every gathering, cooked every meal, bought every gift, and made sure the extended Hilton family felt properly celebrated in the style they expected. Howard's role was to show up, accept compliments on our beautiful home and generous hospitality, and bask in the glow of being the successful family patriarch. What I didn't know was that he was planning to use Christmas dinner as the stage for the most devastating betrayal of our marriage. But, as my grandmother always said, the greatest power comes from others underestimating you. And Howard was about to learn just how much he'd underestimated his dependent wife. The warning signs had been building throughout December, but I was too busy orchestrating what I thought would be our family's perfect Christmas to pay proper attention. Looking back, I realize Howard had been unusually invested in the holiday planning this year. Not in the actual work, of course, but in the guest list and timing. "Make sure we invite the Coopers this year," he'd said in early December, referring to his business associates. "And what about that new couple from the country club, the ones with the pharmaceutical money?" I'd found his sudden interest in expanding our intimate family gatherings strange, but Howard had always been social. I assumed he was just feeling generous with the holiday spirit. Our traditional Christmas dinner typically included our children, Emily and Gerald, with their families, Howard's elderly Uncle Tony, and a few close family friends. This year, Howard wanted nearly 30 people. "Don't you think that's a bit much?" I'd asked while reviewing the catering estimates. "The dining room will be packed." "Nonsense," Howard had replied, that charming smile I'd fallen in love with decades ago lighting up his face. "The holidays are about bringing people together. Besides, we have so much to be grateful for this year." So I'd thrown myself into planning the kind of Christmas dinner that would cement the Hilton family's reputation for gracious entertaining. I hired additional catering staff, had the house professionally decorated, and arranged for a string quartet to play during cocktails. Every detail was perfect, from the imported linens to the custom floral arrangements that cost more than most people's monthly salary. What I didn't realize was that Howard was planning his own kind of performance. Throughout December, his business meetings with Joanna became more frequent. Phone calls that he took in his study with the door closed, weekend trips to inspect properties that seemed to require his assistant's presence but not his wife's input. When I casually mentioned that Joanna seemed to be working an unusual number of hours, Howard's response was swift and defensive. "She's ambitious, Julia. Not everyone is content to just maintain things. Some people want to build something significant." The implication stung, but I'd grown used to Howard's subtle dismissals over the years. In his mind, my role was to maintain things, the household, the social calendar, the family relationships, while he handled the real work of managing our wealth and status. If only he knew that every property he was supposedly inspecting, every investment he was supposedly managing, existed because of my money and my decisions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Our daughter Emily noticed something during her Christmas shopping visit 3 days before the dinner. She'd stopped by unexpectedly and found me in the kitchen reviewing the final catering details while Howard was at yet another urgent meeting. "Mom, you seem stressed," she'd observed, settling at the kitchen island with her coffee. "More than usual for the holidays." Emily was 34, married to a good man named Cooper, with 2 young children who called me Grandma Jules. She'd inherited my practical nature and my ability to read people, though she'd never needed to develop the survival skills that came with financial invisibility. "Just want everything to be perfect," I'd said, which was true enough. "You know how your father likes these gatherings to reflect well on the family." Emily had studied me with the expression she'd inherited from me, the one that missed nothing. "Mom, when was the last time you did something just because you wanted to, not because Dad expected it?" The question had caught me off guard. When indeed? Even my secret management of our wealth was motivated by maintaining Howard's image and our family's security. When had I last made a choice purely for my own satisfaction? "I want the family to be happy," I'd deflected. "That makes me happy." But Emily's question lingered as I finalized the arrangements for Christmas dinner. The guest list had grown to 32 people, exactly as Howard requested. The menu featured all his favorites and none of mine. The seating arrangement positioned him at the head of the table with clear sightlines to every guest, while I would be managing details from the kitchen for most of the evening. Even the gifts under our 12-foot Fraser fir reflected this dynamic. Howard's presents to me were beautiful but impersonal, expensive jewelry that could have been chosen for any woman of my social standing. My gifts to him were carefully selected based on his interests, his needs, his image. I'd spent weeks finding the perfect vintage watch to add to his collection, while he'd clearly had his secretary order my diamond earrings from Tiffany. The irony wasn't lost on me. Every beautiful thing in our house, every prestigious address, every investment that allowed Howard to maintain his image as a successful patriarch, all of it came from my grandmother's legacy and my careful stewardship. Yet I was planning a party designed to showcase Howard's generosity and status while I remained in the background, ensuring everything ran smoothly. On December 22nd, the day before our Christmas dinner, Howard made an announcement that should have been my final warning. "Julia, I've invited Joanna to join us tomorrow evening," he'd said casually while reading his newspaper at breakfast. "She doesn't have family in the area, and it seems cruel to leave her alone during the holidays." I'd paused in the middle of reviewing the seating chart. "That's thoughtful of you. I'll add a place setting." "Actually, I've already adjusted the arrangements," Howard had said, not looking up from his paper. "Joanna will be seated near me so I can introduce her properly to the Coopers and the other business contacts. First impressions matter in our circles." Something cold had settled in my stomach at his casual presumption. Howard had never rearranged seating without consulting me. He'd never shown such concern for his assistant's social comfort. And he'd certainly never positioned an employee so prominently at a family gathering. But I'd said nothing. After 32 years of marriage, I'd learned to pick my battles carefully. I had no idea that this Christmas dinner would become the stage for the battle of my lifetime. The morning of December 23rd dawned gray and cold, matching my increasingly uneasy mood. I'd spent the previous evening making final preparations, arranging flowers, setting the table with our finest china, and coordinating with the catering staff who would arrive at noon. Everything was perfect, just as Howard expected. What I hadn't expected was to find him in his study at 7 in the morning, door closed, speaking in hushed tones on the phone. The conversation stopped abruptly when I knocked to offer him coffee. "Just handling some last-minute business details," he'd explained, but his smile seemed forced. "You know how it is during the holidays. Everyone wants things wrapped up before the new year." I'd nodded and left his coffee on the desk. But something about his demeanor felt off. In 32 years of marriage, I'd learned to read Howard's moods like a barometer. This wasn't his usual pre-party excitement, or even his standard work stress. This was something else entirely. The catering staff arrived promptly at noon, transforming our kitchen into a professional operation. I loved this part of entertaining: the organized chaos, the careful timing, the satisfaction of seeing a complex plan come together flawlessly. It was probably the closest I came to feeling truly competent in my public role as Howard's wife. As I coordinated with the head chef about the timing for the roasted beef tenderloin, Joanna arrived. She was early. The invitation had been for 5 o'clock cocktails, and it was barely 3. But she swept in as if she belonged, carrying what appeared to be an overnight bag. "Mrs. Hilton," she said with that bright smile that never quite reached her eyes, "Mr. Hilton asked me to come early to help with any last-minute preparations." I stared at the overnight bag. Help with preparations? "Oh, just in case the weather turns," she said airily. "Howard, Mr. Hilton, thought it might be safer if I stayed over rather than driving home late on Christmas Eve." Howard had never mentioned this arrangement to me. In fact, we'd never had any employee, assistant, or even close friend stay overnight during a party. Our guest bedrooms were for family visits, not business associates. "How thoughtful of him," I managed, my voice steady despite the growing knot in my stomach. "The blue guest room at the top of the stairs is available." As Joanna headed upstairs with her bag, I found Howard in his study, now dressed in the charcoal suit I'd had tailored for him last month. "Howard, Joanna mentioned you'd arranged for her to stay overnight?" He barely looked up from his phone. "Weather forecast shows possible snow," seemed prudent. The weather forecast I'd checked that morning had shown clear skies and temperatures in the 40s, not exactly blizzard conditions requiring emergency accommodations. "I see. It would have been helpful if you'd mentioned it earlier so I could prepare the room properly." "I'm sure it's fine, Julia. You always keep the house in perfect condition." His tone was distracted, dismissive. "Is there anything else? I have some calls to make before the guests arrive." I stood in the doorway of his study, looking at my husband of 32 years as he focused on his phone rather than meeting my eyes. When had I become such an interruption in his life? When had my questions become inconveniences rather than conversations? The first guests began arriving at 5, and I slipped into my familiar role as hostess. Welcoming smiles, perfect timing on the cocktails, seamless introductions that made everyone feel important and connected. I wore the emerald green dress Howard preferred and the diamond necklace he'd given me for our 20th anniversary, armor disguised as elegance. Howard was in his element, charming the Coopers with stories about recent property acquisitions, impressing the pharmaceutical couple with his knowledge of Boston's luxury market. He moved through the room with confidence, accepting compliments on our beautiful home and gracious hospitality as if he'd personally arranged every detail. Joanna stayed close to Howard's side throughout the cocktail hour, laughing at his stories with enthusiasm that seemed calculated rather than genuine. She was undeniably beautiful in a sleek black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and young enough that her admiration felt intoxicating rather than routine. I watched from across the room as Howard introduced her to various guests as his invaluable assistant, his hand lingering on her lower back in a way that made my chest tighten. The way she looked at him, with that combination of admiration and something deeper, suddenly made everything clear. During dinner, seated at the opposite end of our long mahogany table, I had a perfect view of Howard and Joanna's interactions. The subtle touches, the shared glances, the way he leaned in to hear her comments as if she were the most fascinating person in the room. Our other guests seemed oblivious, caught up in their own conversations and the excellent wine I'd selected, but I saw everything. What hurt most wasn't the obvious attraction between them, but the way Howard seemed more animated and engaged than I'd seen him in years. When had he stopped looking at me with that kind of interest? When had our conversations become purely functional rather than genuinely connective? As I managed the dinner service, ensuring everyone's wine glass stayed full and the conversation flowed smoothly, I found myself observing my own life from a strange distance. Here I was, orchestrating a perfect evening in a house I'd secretly paid for, serving guests with money I'd secretly earned, while my husband fell in love with another woman right in front of me. The final blow came during dessert. Howard stood to make a toast, his face flushed with wine and confidence. I want to thank my beautiful wife, Julia, for putting together this magnificent evening, he began, raising his glass toward me with a smile that once would have warmed my heart. And I want to thank all of you for being here to help us celebrate not just Christmas, but some exciting changes coming in the new year. A murmur of curiosity rippled through the guests. I felt my pulse quicken. What changes? Howard's eyes found Joanna's across the table, and something passed between them that made my blood turn cold. But we'll save those announcements for another time, he concluded with that charming laugh. Tonight is about family, friends, and gratitude. As our guests raised their glasses and applauded, I realized that whatever Howard was planning, Christmas Eve was just the beginning. I barely slept that night. Long after the last guest had departed and the catering staff had cleaned everything to perfection, I lay in bed listening to Howard's steady breathing and replaying every moment of the evening. The meaningful glances between him and Joanna, his cryptic comment about exciting changes, the way he'd seemed like a stranger performing for an audience rather than my husband hosting our friends. When I finally drifted off around 3 in the morning, my dreams were filled with fragments of conversation and Joanna's bright laugh echoing through our house. Christmas morning dawned crisp and clear, no sign of the threatening weather that had supposedly necessitated Joanna's overnight stay. I woke to find Howard's side of the bed empty and the sound of voices drifting up from the kitchen. Checking the clock, I saw it was barely 7:30. I pulled on my robe and made my way downstairs, expecting to find Howard making his usual Christmas morning coffee. Instead, I discovered him at the kitchen island with Joanna, both fully dressed, sharing what appeared to be an intimate breakfast for two. "Good morning," I said, my voice carefully neutral despite the shock of finding another woman in my kitchen on Christmas morning, clearly comfortable and at home. "Oh, Julia," Howard said, barely glancing up from his newspaper. "Joanna was up early, too. I made coffee." Joanna smiled at me with that practiced brightness that had become so familiar. "I hope you don't mind, Mrs. Hilton. I'm always an early riser, and Howard was kind enough to keep me company." Howard, not Mr. Hilton, as she'd called him yesterday in front of the guests. The casual intimacy of using his first name felt like a slap. "Of course," I replied, moving to the coffee pot that Howard had apparently made for two, with no thought of his wife. "Emily and Gerald will be here with the grandchildren around noon for our traditional gift exchange." "Actually," Howard said, folding his newspaper with deliberate precision, "that's something we need to discuss." The tone of his voice, formal, rehearsed, made my stomach drop. This was the voice he used for business presentations, not family conversations. "What do you mean?" Howard stood up, smoothing his sweater in a gesture I recognized as preparation for delivering uncomfortable news. Beside him, Joanna remained seated but alert, like an audience member waiting for a performance to begin. "Julia, we need to talk about our future, about changes that need to happen." I gripped my coffee mug tighter, the ceramic warm against my suddenly cold hands. "What kind of changes?" "Our marriage hasn't been working for a long time," he said, the words clearly rehearsed. "We both know it. We've been going through the motions, maintaining appearances, but there's no real connection anymore. No passion, no growth, no partnership." The irony of him saying partnership while standing next to his assistant made me want to laugh, but nothing about this felt funny. "Howard, if you're having some kind of midlife crisis—" "This isn't a crisis," he interrupted firmly. "This is clarity. For the first time in years, I know what I want, what I need." His eyes found Joanna's, and the look that passed between them told me everything I needed to know about what, or rather who, he thought he needed. "I want a divorce, Julia." The words hung in the air of my kitchen like smoke from a fire I hadn't seen coming. Around us, the Christmas decorations I'd so carefully arranged seemed to mock the destruction of everything I'd thought was permanent. "On Christmas morning?" I whispered. "You're doing this on Christmas morning?" "I know the timing isn't ideal," Howard said, his tone taking on the patronizing quality I'd grown to hate over the years. but dragging this out would only make things harder for everyone. Better to be honest about what we both know is true. What we both know? My voice was rising despite my efforts to stay calm. I don't know anything about this, Howard. Yesterday we hosted 30 people in our home, and you were perfectly happy to have me manage every detail while you played the charming host. Now suddenly our marriage is over? Joanna shifted uncomfortably, perhaps realizing she was witnessing a more raw moment than she'd anticipated. But she didn't leave. She stayed, watching my humiliation with what looked like curiosity rather than discomfort. The truth is, Howard continued, we've grown apart. You've become comfortable, set in your ways. You're content to just maintain what we have, rather than building something bigger, something exciting.
There it was again. The dismissal of my role as merely maintaining while he did the important work of building. If only he knew that every single thing he was proud of building had been funded by my invisible contributions. And Joanna represents something bigger? I asked, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. Howard had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, but Joanna surprised me by speaking up. Mrs. Hilton, I want you to know this isn't how I wanted things to happen, she said, her voice soft but confident. But sometimes love doesn't follow convenient timelines. Love. She'd actually said love. How long? I asked, looking directly at Howard. Julia, how long have you been having an affair with your assistant? Howard's jaw tightened. 6 months. But it's not just physical, Julia. We connect on a level that you and I haven't in years. She understands my vision, my ambitions. She wants to build something meaningful together. Build something meaningful with my money, using the wealth I'd secretly created and managed for 32 years. And what exactly do you think you're going to build? I asked quietly. Without me, without our marriage, what foundation do you imagine you'll have for this exciting new life? Howard's expression shifted to something between pity and impatience. Julia, you've been dependent on me our entire marriage. I understand this is frightening for you, but you'll be fine. You'll get your fair share in the divorce, and you can find a nice, smaller place. Maybe take up some hobbies. You're still attractive for your age. For my age, as if I were a car he was trading in for a newer model. What I have with Joanna is different, he continued. She's ambitious, driven. Together we can expand the property business, maybe go national. The Hilton name has potential that we've never fully realized. I stared at my husband of 32 years, this man who thought he was dismissing a dependent housewife, and felt something crystallize inside me. A cold, clear understanding of exactly how much power I actually held. I see, I said, and you've already made all these plans without consulting me. What's to consult about? Howard asked. You've never shown any interest in the business side of our life. If only he knew. After Howard's bombshell, I excused myself with a dignity I didn't feel, retreating to my bedroom while they continued their cozy Christmas morning in my kitchen. My hands were shaking as I closed the door behind me, 32 years of marriage crumbling in the space of a 10-minute conversation. But as I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the family photos that lined my dresser, something shifted inside me. The initial shock gave way to a cold, calculating clarity that reminded me of my grandmother's voice. The greatest power comes from others underestimating you, Julia. Howard had just made the biggest miscalculation of his life. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in months but knew by heart. Mr. Lauren, it's Julia Hilton. I'm sorry to bother you on Christmas morning, but I need to schedule an emergency meeting about the trust. Baron Lauren had been my grandmother's lawyer and had remained my secret counsel for over 3 decades, managing the labyrinth of holding companies and investments that comprised my real wealth. To Howard, Mr. Lauren was simply the family's estate attorney who handled routine legal matters. Howard had no idea that his family legacy existed entirely at my discretion. Mrs. Hilton, is everything all right? You sound distressed.
My husband has just informed me he wants a divorce. He's also informed me that he plans to expand his property business nationally with his new girlfriend. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I see. And does Mr. Hilton understand the actual ownership structure of his assets? He has no idea. He believes he's inherited everything from his family, just as we've allowed him to believe for 32 years. Given the circumstances, I think it would be wise to review all the documentation. Can you meet me at my office this afternoon? I'll cancel my Christmas plans. That's very kind of you, Mr. Lauren. Yes, I'll be there at 2 o'clock. After hanging up, I sat quietly for several minutes, listening to the murmur of voices and occasional laughter from downstairs. Howard and Joanna were probably planning their brilliant future together, discussing how they'd leverage his properties and his reputation to build their empire. The irony was almost amusing. Every property Howard managed, every investment he took credit for, every dollar he spent maintaining his image as a successful businessman, all of it flowed from the trust I controlled. The prestigious Beacon Hill office space where he met clients, owned by one of my holding companies. The luxury car he drove to impress business contacts, leased through another company I owned. Even the house we'd lived in for 20 years had been purchased entirely with my money, though the deed was carefully structured to maintain the illusion of Hilton family ownership. I heard Emily's voice in the foyer, arriving with her family for our traditional Christmas gift exchange. The sound of my grandchildren's excited chatter drifted upstairs, and I realized I would have to find a way to explain why Christmas was ending before it had truly begun. Taking a deep breath, I composed myself and went downstairs to face whatever Howard had planned for this revelation. I found a family gathered in the living room around the Christmas tree. Emily and her husband Cooper with their 2 children, our son Gerald, who had driven down from Vermont, and of course, Howard and Joanna. The scene looked almost normal, except for the tension radiating from Howard and the way Joanna perched on the edge of the sofa like she was ready to flee. "Mom," Emily said, approaching me with concern, "Dad was just telling us about some big changes. What's going on?" I looked at Howard, who had the decency to appear somewhat uncomfortable under the scrutiny of our adult children. "Why don't you explain, Howard, since you've apparently thought this through so thoroughly?" Howard cleared his throat, slipping into his presentation mode. "Your mother and I have decided that after 32 years, we've grown in different directions. We're going to pursue a divorce so we can both find happiness with people who better suit our current life goals." Gerald, who had inherited my ability to read between lines, looked from his father to Joanna with dawning understanding. "And Miss Billets is here because—" "Joanna and I have developed feelings for each other," Howard said, his voice gaining confidence as he warmed to his narrative. "She's going to help me expand the business in ways your mother never showed interest in supporting." The words stung, but not as much as they might have if I didn't know what I knew. Howard truly believed I had been a passive observer of his success rather than its architect. "So let me understand this correctly," Emily said, her voice dangerously calm. "You're leaving Mom on Christmas morning for your assistant, and you're planning to build some business empire together?" "Emily, I know this is hard to hear, but sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions." "Difficult for whom?" Gerald interrupted. "Seems pretty convenient for you, Dad. You get a younger woman, and Mom gets what, exactly?" Howard's expression hardened slightly. "Your mother will be fine. She'll receive a fair settlement, and frankly, she's never had to worry about supporting herself. This might be good for her, force her to develop some independence." Independence? From the woman who had been secretly supporting him for 3 decades. That's when I knew exactly what I had to do. I left my family in stunned silence, making my excuses about needing some air and time to process Howard's announcement. Emily offered to come with me, but I assured her I needed to think alone. What I really needed was to understand exactly what weapons I had in the war Howard had just declared. Baron Lauren's law office occupied the top floor of a stately brownstone on Beacon Hill, a building that, ironically, I owned through one of my holding companies. He'd been waiting for me despite the holiday, a distinguished man in his 70s who had guided my financial decisions with the same careful discretion he'd shown my grandmother. "Mrs. Hilton," he said, gesturing me to the familiar leather chair across from his mahogany desk. I've pulled all the relevant files. Before we discuss your options, I need to ask, does your husband have any idea about the true structure of your assets? None whatsoever, I replied. As far as Howard knows, he inherited everything from his family's old Boston money. He believes he's been managing ancestral wealth, not my carefully invested inheritance. Mr. Lauren opened a thick folder, revealing documents I recognized: trust agreements, property deeds, investment portfolios, all meticulously organized over 3 decades. Let me refresh your memory about what you actually control, he said, adjusting his reading glasses. The Hilton family trust, which your husband believes he inherited, was indeed nearly bankrupt when you married. Every dollar that has rebuilt it came from your grandmother's legacy and your subsequent investments. He spread several documents across the desk. Your current holdings include the primary residence in Cambridge, valued at $3.2 million. The vacation home in Martha's Vineyard, worth $1.8 million. The office building where your husband's property management company operates, valued at $2.1 million. 14 rental properties throughout the Boston area with a combined value of approximately $12 million. The numbers rolled past me like a familiar song. I knew these figures by heart, had watched them grow over 32 years of careful stewardship. Additionally, Mr. Loren continued, you hold controlling interests in 3 separate investment portfolios, bonds and securities, worth $8.7 million, and liquid assets totaling $2.4 million. The total value of assets under your control is approximately $47.3 million. Hearing it laid out so starkly was breathtaking, even for me. My grandmother's modest real estate investments had become a substantial fortune under my management, all while Howard believed he was the heir to old money. What does Howard actually own in his name? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Very little, Mr. Loren confirmed. His personal checking and savings accounts, his vehicle, and his clothing. Everything else, the house, the business assets, the investments he takes credit for managing, all of it exists at your discretion. And if I were to revoke that discretion? Mr. Loren's expression was carefully neutral, but I caught a glint of something that might have been satisfaction in his eyes. Your husband would discover that the successful businessman persona he's maintained for 32 years was entirely dependent on your generosity. Without your assets, he would have essentially nothing. I sat back in my chair, absorbing the full scope of my power. Howard was downstairs in my house, planning his future with his assistant, believing he was the patriarch of a wealthy family, when he was actually entirely dependent on the wife he'd just dismissed as a burden. There's something else you should know, Mr. Loren said, pulling out another document. 3 months ago, your husband approached me about liquidating some family assets to fund an expansion of his property business. He specifically mentioned wanting to go national, possibly opening offices in New York and Philadelphia. My blood ran cold. Of course not. I told him any major asset changes would require extensive documentation and family consultation. But Mrs. Hilton, he was very insistent. He seemed to believe these assets were his to manage as he saw fit. So Howard had already been planning this expansion with Joanna, already moving toward decisions that would have spent my money on their shared dreams. The betrayal went deeper than just the affair. He'd been preparing to steal my life's work to fund his new relationship. What are my options? I asked quietly. Legally, you have complete control. You could revoke his access to all assets immediately. The house, the business premises, the cars, the credit lines, everything could be transferred or terminated by the end of the week. And practically? Mr. Loren leaned forward, his expression growing serious. Mrs. Hilton, your husband has been living a fiction for 32 years. If you choose to reveal the truth, it will destroy not just his relationship with Miss Billets, but his entire understanding of who he is and what he's accomplished. Are you prepared for that level of devastation? I thought about Howard in my kitchen this morning, casually destroying our marriage while his girlfriend watched. I thought about his dismissive comments about my abilities, his assumption that I would be grateful for whatever scraps he chose to leave me. Mr. Loren, I said, my voice steady with newfound resolve, I think it's time my husband learned the truth about the Hilton family fortune. When would you like to proceed? I smiled, feeling my grandmother's spirit guiding me. Tomorrow is December 26th. What better time for unwrapping the truth? I returned home that evening to find Howard and Joanna in the living room, surrounded by real estate brochures and laptop computers, planning their future empire with the casual confidence of people who believed they held all the cards. They looked up as I entered, Howard's expression carefully neutral, while Joanna offered one of her practiced smiles. "How was your drive?" Howard asked, as if this were any normal evening rather than the day he'd destroyed our marriage. "You were gone quite a while." "I needed time to think," I replied truthfully, "to process everything you told me this morning and consider my options." Howard's shoulders relaxed slightly, apparently interpreting my calm demeanor as acceptance of his decision. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this, Julia. I know it's not easy, but it's better for everyone in the long run." Joanna leaned forward with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Mrs. Hilton, I want you to know that Howard and I have discussed making this transition as smooth as possible for you. We understand this house has sentimental value, so we're prepared to let you stay here for a reasonable period while you find something more suitable for your needs." The audacity was breathtaking. They were graciously allowing me to remain temporarily in my own house, purchased entirely with my money. "That's very thoughtful," I managed, proud of how steady my voice remained. "And what did you have in mind as suitable for my needs?" Howard gestured dismissively. "Something smaller, obviously. A nice condo, maybe in one of those active senior communities. You'd probably enjoy having neighbors your own age, planned activities, less responsibility for maintenance and upkeep." They had reduced me to a stereotype, the discarded older wife who should be grateful for a modest apartment and some social activities to fill her empty days. The woman who had built their fortune was apparently suited only for shuffleboard and book clubs. "And the business?" I asked. "Your expansion plans?" Howard's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm I hadn't seen in years. "Joanna has some brilliant ideas about scaling up. We're looking at offices in New York first, then Philadelphia. The Hilton name opens doors, and with her MBA and my experience, we could build something really significant." "It's so exciting," Joanna added, her hand finding Howard's arm in a gesture that was clearly meant to mark territory. "Howard has such vision, such potential that's been underutilized. We could easily triple the business within 5 years." Underutilized, because apparently being married to me had somehow limited Howard's potential, rather than providing the foundation for everything he'd accomplished. "That sounds ambitious," I said. "Expensive too, I would imagine. Commercial real estate in Manhattan, staff, marketing. Where will the capital come from?" Howard waved the question away with confident dismissal. "The family trust has more than enough liquidity for initial investments. Plus, we'll be generating revenue quickly once we establish our presence in the market." They had it all figured out. My money would fund their dreams while I was shuffled off to a retirement community, grateful for whatever allowance they deemed appropriate. "Well," I said, rising from my chair, "it sounds like you have everything planned. I should let you get back to your strategizing." As I headed toward the stairs, Howard called after me. "Julia, I'm glad you're taking this so well. I was worried you might make things difficult." I paused at the bottom of the staircase, turning back to look at them, my husband of 32 years and the woman who thought she was inheriting my life's work. "Oh, Howard," I said, with a smile that probably looked more serene than he deserved. "I wouldn't dream of making things difficult. In fact, I think tomorrow might bring some wonderful clarity for everyone involved." Once upstairs, I called Emily and Gerald, asking them to meet me for lunch the next day. I also sent a text to Mr. Loren. "Please prepare all documentation. We proceed tomorrow at 2 p.m. Then I sat at my dressing table, looking at myself in the mirror that had reflected my face for 20 years in this house. The woman looking back at me appeared calm, almost peaceful, despite the chaos of the past 24 hours. Tomorrow, Howard and Joanna would learn what my grandmother had taught me decades ago, that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone underestimates. I pulled out the jewelry box where I kept my grandmother's letters, the ones that had guided my financial decisions for 32 years. Her final letter, written just before her death, contained advice I had never needed until now. There may come a day, my dear Julia, when someone tries to take what you've built or dismiss what you've accomplished. When that day comes, remember that you hold the power. Use it wisely, but use it completely. Never let anyone diminish you or claim your work as their own. That day had finally arrived. As Howard and Joanna continued planning their future empire downstairs with my money, I began planning their reckoning. By this time tomorrow, they would understand exactly whose empire they had been living in all along. The game was about to begin, and for the first time in 32 years, I would be playing to win. December 26th dawned clear and bright with that crystalline winter light that made everything sharper, more defined. I woke early, feeling remarkably calm for someone about to detonate her entire life. Howard's side of the bed was already empty. He'd taken to rising early to make coffee for Joanna, a courtesy he hadn't extended to me in years. As I dressed carefully in my navy wool suit, the one I wore for important meetings, I could hear their voices drifting up from the kitchen, discussing their plans with the easy intimacy of people who believed their future was secure. If only they knew how dramatically that future was about to change. I found them at the kitchen island, papers spread between coffee cups and croissant crumbs. Howard looked up with that patronizing smile I'd grown to despise. "Good morning, Julia. Sleep well?" "Very well, thank you." I poured myself coffee from the pot they'd made for two, noting how Joanna shifted uncomfortably at having to share Howard's attention. "What are you working on so early?" "Lease agreements," Joanna answered with barely contained excitement. "We found the perfect office space in Manhattan. The broker thinks we can move quickly if we have the capital ready." Howard leaned back with satisfied confidence. "Prime location in Midtown. It'll cost us, but the Hilton name deserves a prestigious address. First impressions matter in this business." The Hilton name. The irony was almost painful. Howard was so proud of a family legacy that existed only because of my money and my grandmother's wisdom. "How much?" I asked casually. "Initial outlay will be about $800,000, Howard replied. "First year's rent, security deposit, renovation costs, staffing. But the revenue potential more than justifies the investment." $800,000 of my money to fund his new life with his mistress. The casual assumption that these funds were his to spend made my chest tighten with controlled rage. "That's quite an investment," I observed. "I hope you've thoroughly researched the market." Joanna jumped in eagerly. "Oh, we have. I've been analyzing comparable properties and revenue streams for months. The opportunity is incredible, Mrs. Hilton. Howard has been so conservative with the family assets over the years. There's tremendous potential for growth if we're willing to take calculated risks." Conservative, because apparently my careful stewardship of assets to ensure long-term security was holding back Howard's true potential, rather than creating the foundation for everything he claimed to have built. "Well," I said, checking my watch, "I should let you get back to your planning. I have lunch with Emily and Gerald, then some errands to run." Howard barely looked up from his paperwork. "Take your time. Joanna and I will probably be working on this all day. We want to have everything ready to present to the lawyer on Monday." Present to the lawyer? They were planning to march into Mr. Lauren's office and demand access to funds that belonged entirely to me, believing they were entitled to family money that had never existed in the first place. I met my children at a quiet restaurant in Harvard Square, choosing a private corner table where we could speak freely. Both Emily and Gerald arrived looking concerned and confused, still processing their father's Christmas morning bombshell. "Mom, what's really going on? Emily's explanation yesterday didn't make any sense. You and Dad seemed fine at the party. Where did this come from?" I had spent 32 years protecting their image of their father, allowing them to see him as the successful patriarch, rather than understanding the complex reality of our family's finances. Now, faced with the destruction of our marriage, I realized they deserved the truth. There are things about our family's financial situation that you've never known, I began carefully. Things that your father doesn't know either. Gerald frowned. What do you mean? Dad's always managed the family money, the properties, the business. Are you saying there are problems? Not problems, I said. Quite the opposite. But the source of our wealth isn't what you've been told. Over the next hour, I explained everything. My grandmother's secret real estate empire, the depleted Hilton family trust, the 32 years of careful investment and management that had created our current prosperity, the holding companies and trusts that protected our assets while maintaining the fiction of old Boston money. Both my children listened in stunned silence as I revealed that every success their father claimed, every property he managed, every investment he took credit for, had been funded and directed by my invisible hand. So, Dad doesn't actually own anything? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Your father owns his personal effects and his business reputation, I confirmed. Everything else, the house, the rental properties, the office building, the investment portfolios, all of it belongs to trusts that I control. Gerald leaned back in his chair, processing the magnitude of what I'd revealed. And he has no idea? None. He believes he inherited everything from his family, just as I allowed him to believe for 32 years. Mom, Emily said quietly, what are you going to do? I met both their eyes, seeing my own determination reflected in their faces. I'm going to tell him the truth, this afternoon, and then your father and his assistant are going to learn exactly whose money they've been planning to spend on their new life together. The time for invisibility was over. I returned home at exactly 2 o'clock to find Howard and Joanna exactly where I'd left them, now surrounded by even more paperwork. They had transformed my dining room into their makeshift corporate headquarters, complete with financial projections and architectural plans spread across the table where we'd shared Christmas dinner just 2 days earlier. Perfect timing, Howard said without looking up. We've finalized the Manhattan proposal. The numbers are even better than we initially projected. Wonderful, I replied, setting my purse down with deliberate care. Before you go any further with your planning, though, I think we need to have a conversation about those numbers. Something in my tone must have caught their attention because both Howard and Joanna looked up, their expressions shifting from excitement to uncertainty. What kind of conversation? Howard asked, his voice taking on that cautious quality he used when he sensed potential complications. The kind where we discuss exactly where you think the money for this expansion is coming from. Howard's expression hardened slightly. Julia, we've been through this. The family trust has more than adequate resources for our business plans. This isn't really your concern. Actually, I said, moving to the head of the table where Howard typically sat, it's entirely my concern, because there is no Hilton family trust. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the antique clock ticking in the hallway. Howard stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. What are you talking about? He asked slowly. I reached into my purse and withdrew the folder Mr. Lauren had prepared, placing it on the table between their scattered plans and projections. The Hilton family fortune that you've been managing for 32 years never existed, I said clearly. Your grandfather lost most of the family money gambling. Your father spent the rest on bad investments. When we married, the Hilton Trust was essentially bankrupt. Howard's face had gone pale. That's impossible. The properties, the investments, the business. All came from my grandmother's inheritance, I continued. Every dollar you've spent, every property you've managed, every investment you've taken credit for, all of it was funded by money I inherited and carefully grew over 3 decades. Joanna looked from me to Howard with dawning comprehension and horror. Howard, what is she talking about? She's lying, Howard said, but his voice lacked conviction. This is some kind of desperate attempt to To what? I interrupted. To prevent you from spending my money on your affair? To stop you from stealing the fortune I built to fund your new life with your assistant? I opened the folder and began placing documents on the table: property deeds, trust agreements, investment portfolios, all bearing my name or my holding company's. The house we've lived in for 20 years? I bought it. The office building where you meet clients? I own it. The 14 rental properties you think you manage? All mine. The investment accounts you believe you've been growing? Every dollar came from my careful reinvestment of my grandmother's legacy. Joanna looked from me to Howard with dawning comprehension and horror. Howard, what is she talking about? She's lying, Howard said, but his voice lacked conviction. This is some kind of desperate attempt to... To what? I interrupted. To prevent you from spending my money on your affair? To stop you from stealing the fortune I built to fund your new life with your assistant? I opened the folder and began placing documents on the table: property deeds, trust agreements, investment portfolios, all bearing my name or my holding company's. The house we've lived in for 20 years? I bought it. The office building where you meet clients? I own it. The 14 rental properties you think you manage? All mine. The investment accounts you believe you've been growing? Every dollar came from my careful reinvestment of my grandmother's legacy. Joanna looked from me to Howard with dawning comprehension and horror. Howard, what is she talking about? She's lying, Howard said, but his voice lacked conviction. This is some kind of desperate attempt to... To what? I interrupted. To prevent you from spending my money on your affair? To stop you from stealing the fortune I built to fund your new life with your assistant? I opened the folder and began placing documents on the table: property deeds, trust agreements, investment portfolios, all bearing my name or my holding company's. The house we've lived in for 20 years? I bought it. The office building where you meet clients? I own it. The 14 rental properties you think you manage? All mine. The investment accounts you believe you've been growing? Every dollar came from my careful reinvestment of my grandmother's legacy. Howard stared at the documents as if they might disappear if he looked hard enough. This can't be real. It's very real, I said gently. And Howard, when you walk into Mr. Lauren's office on Monday demanding $800,000 for your Manhattan expansion, he's going to tell you the same thing he's been protecting you from knowing for 32 years. You don't have any money to spend. Joanna stood abruptly, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. You've been lying to him? To everyone? For decades? I've been protecting him, I corrected, allowing him to maintain his dignity and his reputation while I quietly ensured our family's security. But that protection ends today. Howard finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Everything I've accomplished, everything I've built. You've built nothing, Howard. You've been living off my accomplishments while taking credit for my work. The devastation in his eyes was almost enough to make me feel sorry for him. Almost. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Howard stared at the documents spread across the table, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up deed after deed, each one bearing my name or my holding company's. Joanna remained frozen by her chair, her face cycling through shock, anger, and what looked like genuine panic.
"This is why you wanted a divorce," Howard said finally, his voice hollow. "You've been planning this, waiting for the right moment to destroy me." I wanted a divorce? I couldn't help but laugh, though there was no humor in it. Howard, you're the one who announced on Christmas morning that our marriage was over. You're the one who brought your girlfriend into our home and discussed your exciting future plans right in front of me. "But you've been hiding this from me for 30 years, he said, gesturing weakly at the papers, making me believe I was something I'm not. "I was protecting the man I loved," I replied. "I could have told you the truth at any time, Howard. I could have demanded recognition for my contributions, insisted on being acknowledged as the real force behind our success. Instead, I let you believe you were the brilliant businessman because I thought our marriage was more important than my ego. Joanna finally found her voice. So, all those expansion plans, the Manhattan office, everything we discussed, would require my approval and my money, I confirmed. Money that I'm no longer willing to provide for your joint venture. Howard's shock was giving way to anger now, his face flushing red. You can't do this, Julia. 32 years of marriage means something. You can't just cut me off because you're jealous of Joanna. Jealous? The word came out sharper than I intended. Howard, I'm not jealous of your assistant. I'm disappointed that after 3 decades of building a life together, you were willing to throw it all away for someone who sees you as a meal ticket. That's not— Joanna started to protest, but I held up my hand. Miss Billets, let me ask you something. When you fell in love with Howard, what exactly did you think you were falling in love with? His charm? His intelligence? Or was it perhaps his apparent wealth and status? Her silence was answer enough. Howard was frantically shuffling through the documents now, as if he might find something that would contradict what he was seeing. There has to be something in my name, the business at least. I've been running it for years. The business operates out of a building I own, using capital I provided, managing properties I purchased, I said gently. You've been an excellent frontman, Howard, but that's all you've ever been. The cruel reality of it hit him visibly. His shoulders sagged as 32 years of imagined accomplishments crumbled around him. What happens now? He asked quietly. Now you learn what it's like to live without my financial support, I replied. You'll discover very quickly what you're actually worth on your own. Joanna was already gathering her papers, her overnight bag, her dreams of Manhattan expansion. I should go, she said, not meeting either of our eyes. Yes, I agreed. You should. As she fled toward the door, Howard called after her desperately. Joanna, wait. We can figure this out. We can find other funding, other opportunities. But she was already gone, and we both knew she wouldn't be back. The man I'd protected for 3 decades finally had to face the truth about who he really was. The house felt eerily quiet after Joanna's hurried departure. Howard sat slumped at the dining room table, still clutching one of the property deeds as if it might somehow transform into something that belonged to him. I watched him process the complete destruction of his self-image, feeling an unexpected mixture of vindication and pity. 32 years, he said finally, his voice barely audible. 32 years of thinking I was building something significant. You were building something significant, I said, taking the seat across from him. A family, a life together, a legacy for our children. That wasn't fake, Howard. That was real. He looked up at me with eyes that seemed to have aged a decade in the past hour. But I didn't build it. You did. I was just, what did you call it? A frontman. The defeat in his voice almost made me regret my words. Almost. You were my partner, I said carefully. Or at least, I thought you were. You handled the public relationships, the client meetings, the social networking that opened doors. Those skills mattered, Howard. I could never have done what you did in those areas. But the real work, the real decisions, the real money, all of that was you. Yes. He set down the deed and rubbed his face with both hands. How long have you known? About my family's finances, I mean. How long have you known the Hilton money was gone? Since before we married. Mr. Lauren told me the truth when he explained my grandmother's inheritance. Howard's head snapped up. You knew before we got married that I was essentially broke, and you married me anyway? I married you because I loved you. The money was irrelevant to me then. But you never told me. You let me believe for over 3 decades that I was living up to my family's legacy, that I was successfully managing ancestral wealth. Why? It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since yesterday. Because I thought it would hurt you to know the truth. Because I believed that what mattered was our happiness together, not who got credit for our financial success. Because I was raised to believe that a good wife supports her husband's confidence even at the cost of her own recognition.
Howard was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. And now? Now I realize that protecting your ego cost me my identity. I spent 32 years making myself smaller so you could feel bigger. I let you take credit for my work, my intelligence, my financial acumen. I became invisible in my own life. I never asked you to do that. You didn't have to ask. You just accepted it. When people praised your business sense, you never corrected them. When industry magazines wrote articles about your success, you never mentioned my contributions. When our own children grew up believing their father was the financial genius of the family, you never told them the truth. Howard's face crumpled. I didn't know. I swear to you, Julia, I didn't know you felt invisible. Because you weren't looking. For 32 years, you weren't really seeing me at all. The accusation hung between us like a blade. Howard opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. What defense could he offer? The evidence was overwhelming, not just in the documents spread across our table, but in the pattern of our entire marriage. What happens now? He asked again, and this time I heard genuine fear in his voice. Now you figure out who Howard Hilton really is when he's not living off Julia Hilton's money. 3 months later, I sat in the sun-drenched conservatory of my new home, a beautiful colonial in Lexington that I'd purchased entirely in my own name. Through the windows, I could see the garden I was planning, space for the pottery studio I'd always wanted, and the home office where I now openly managed my investments without hiding behind shell companies or letting someone else take credit. Emily knocked on the doorframe, carrying 2 cups of tea and wearing the smile I'd been seeing more often lately, pride mixed with relief that her mother had finally stopped pretending to be smaller than she was. "How are you feeling about today?" she asked, settling into the chair across from me. Today was the day Howard would sign the final divorce papers. After 3 months of negotiations, we'd reached a settlement that was generous but realistic. He would receive enough money to start over comfortably, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle he'd grown accustomed to on my investments. Peaceful, I said, surprising myself with the honesty of it. For the first time in decades, I feel completely at peace. And Dad? I sipped my tea, considering the question. Howard had moved into a modest apartment in Cambridge, taken a job with a legitimate real estate firm, and was slowly learning to live within his actual means, rather than his imagined inheritance. The adjustment had been brutal, but he was surviving it. Your father is discovering who he really is beneath all the assumptions about family money and inherited success. It's been humbling for him, but not destructive. He's actually quite good at sales when he's not trying to be a mogul. Have you talked to him? Occasionally. He's seeing a therapist, which I think is helping. He's beginning to understand how the patterns in our marriage developed, how we both played roles in creating a dynamic that ultimately hurt us both. And Joanna? I couldn't help but smile at that. Joanna disappeared the day she learned that Howard's wealth was actually my wealth. Apparently, love doesn't conquer all when all turns out to be a modest salary and a studio apartment. I'm sorry she hurt both of you like that. Don't be. Joanna did us a favor, actually. Without her betrayal, I might have continued living that invisible life indefinitely. Sometimes it takes a crisis to force necessary changes. Through the window, I saw a car pulling into my driveway. Gerald, arriving for our weekly lunch date. Something that had become precious to me in these months of rebuilding my life. My children had been remarkably supportive once they understood the full truth about our family dynamics. "You know what I realized yesterday?" I said to Emily as we watched Gerald approach the house. "For the first time in my adult life, every decision I make is mine alone. This house, this garden, the charities I'm supporting, the investments I'm making, all of it reflects what I actually want, not what I think someone else expects of me. How does that feel?" I looked around at the space I'd created entirely for myself. Bright, open, filled with books and plants and artwork I'd chosen because it spoke to me, and felt that same sense of rightness I'd experienced the day I decided to stop protecting Howard's illusions. It feels like coming home to myself after 32 years of being lost. "Grandma Jules!"
came a voice from the front hall as Gerald's children burst in, followed by their father's laughter. Home to myself and to the family who finally knew exactly who I was and loved me for it.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.